I'm hearing a lot of rhetoric from those opposite about what has occurred over the last 10 years, and it is just simply not matched by the reality on the ground. The Coalition put some $5 billion into the Modern Manufacturing Fund, but it was against quite specific areas which were targeted as national priorities, including things like space, as well as medical products, food products, defence, a range of sectors that were important for our economy. And so a competitive-based program in those important sectors versus $15 billion, $10 billion of which is not actually targeted against anything and will not be subject to further parliamentary scrutiny. That is an enormous amount of taxpayers' money to not have a structured strategic plan for its investment, nor the oversight of the Parliament as the Australian taxpayers' representative to make sure that it is spent wisely. We have seen a whole range of investments in manufacturing through the Coalition's time that has led to a range of important things. In 2022, the National Centre for Vocational Education Research found that the proportion of Australian businesses with apprentices and trainees was at its highest level since 2011. And what that is saying is that the government's investment, not only in training but also in creating the environment where the private sector wanted to invest, was leading to people coming on board. Just some of the grants in South Australia. In October of 2014, the Industry Innovation magazine made the comment that Australia's manufacturing was in decline. Now, 2014, that's at the end of a long period of those opposite being in government. But they were talking about companies that were actually moving ahead, and one of those, just to highlight, is a company in South Australia called RedArc. Now, RedArc are an innovative company, and with Commonwealth support and arranged, so the AMGC grants, for example, in February of 2021, led to an expansion of the workplace there, adopting things like Industry 4 technology. And the point RedArc make is that advanced technology doesn't necessarily mean less jobs, it means better jobs. A $20 million expansion by RedArc, creating over 100 jobs there. And RedArc not only are one of Australia's best-known suppliers into the automotive industry, but they also export now into the defence industry, particularly with lighting and other components into naval programs overseas. Tindo Solar, again in South Australia, one of the only, in fact I think the only company here in Australia that actually makes solar panels. A $5.3 million investment assisted by $1 million from the Australian government to expand their facility to actually become a significant manufacturer of solar panels for the Australian market, creating jobs, creating sovereign capability. Those are the things that were happening under the Coalition government. Into the space sector, the Centre for Defence Industry Capability, for example, investing in small companies like Innovor. Now, I've had a fair bit to do with Innovor. They're a company in South Australia making satellite buses, and they are an example of the kind of company where we need to continue the investment, not just in grants but in contracts, to give them the opportunity to grow. And so the federal government, under the Coalition, invested some $65 million into the nation's space industry. Not only did we actually create the space agency, but we invested in the industry because of the opportunity to not only have sovereign capability but also to get into the $12 billion worth of international market. So the space agency also received funding around Australia's launch capability, some $32.5 million, to help the local sector gain what they call flight qualifications. But what we see under this plan, that focus on space has gone, and space industry is vocal in media at the moment, highlighting the concern that the lack of focus, the lack of investment will hurt the sector and its growth, which has been stellar, no pun intended, under the Coalition, but which is now in risk of stalling. One of the significant things that is disappointing is that the planned strategic update for the space sector, which was launched by the Coalition in an attempt to bring together the streams of both civil investment and defence investment, has gone nowhere under this Labor government. And given the strategic update of 2020, which highlights the threats that Australia is facing, this is a classic example of where sensible procurement policy from the Commonwealth could actually help Australia have sovereign capabilities. So we're not talking just about making a widget for a satellite that's going to be made overseas, but the kind of investment we see in South Australia, where we now have a space manufacturing park funded partly by the coalition government, partly by the then Liberal government in South Australia, partly by industry, is looking to manufacture satellites. We have the launch capability funded in part by the coalition government to have 3 spaceports in Australia capable of launch. And what it means is the kind of outcomes that government should be looking for is actually very specific, in this case, military response options. How do we work with Australian industry, not to make a widget, but to have the capability to build a payload for ISR, intelligence surveillance, reconnaissance, the bus, the satellite bus, the actual vehicle they put it in, the launch platform, so that in a conflict, if the assets that we rely on, often from Europe or in particularly the US, are either taken out of service by an adversary or deployed to areas of greater priority, we have the ability within a short time frame to design an appropriate payload, put it in an appropriate bus into a launch platform and launch into an orbit that will meet our sovereign needs. Companies who can achieve that for Australia will be well placed to actually get products into the global market, and that's the change of thinking we need. The last part, I'm going to run out of time to talk about energy, but the last part on this procurement is that for many companies, particularly in the defence and national security space, but even for things like personal protective equipment, they do need the government to move beyond giving them a grant to actually purchasing things from those companies. And PPE is a classic example that we looked at during the COVID-19 report that my then committee, the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, conducted. And what we found was that the focus of both the private sector and governments of both persuasions to go competitively to the international market for things like respirators and surgical masks meant that in 2015, Kimberley-Clark closed down the last remaining Spunbond factory here in Australia, which is a critical component. Now, through COVID, massive investment to rebuild the capability to make things like respirators, but what we find is that government departments continue, largely, to buy through panels or other policies that push them to overseas suppliers. There has been some change in some states, some change in the Defence Department here, but what we need to see is federal governments not just looking at these large industry policies from a grant perspective, but then following through with contracts, because it's the contracts that will actually enable these businesses to become sustainable, to invest more in workforce and innovation, so that we can have sovereign capabilities, whether it be in space, whether it be in medical products or other areas.